Amazing. So when I was in the US, we had a library called the Mughal Memorial Library in my college. And they had a separate musicology room, which didn't have any of the records that I would typically want to listen to because I used to own a record player back in college. So I would go to record stores and speak with these crate digger record guys who would then help me pick up records. So I would not pick up standard run of the mill records, but they would help me identify some records. Because of that, I was able to get into Billie Holiday, Duke Ellington, this whole, beautiful blues and jazz scene in the US. And then I think I was writing a paper on Billie Holiday. So through that, I learned about how her song Strange Fruit is actually a reference to the hangings of African American slaves on the trees that they did in the South. So the lyrics are strange fruit hanging on the poplar tree, right? And so then I realized that there is a whole like field where people study, I guess, what is ethnomusicology. And of course, when I was reading your bio for the other interview we just wrapped up, I got intrigued. But you have done your doctorate in ethnomusicology around Indian classical music?
Yes,
Yeah.
that's
What does that entail exactly? If you can't watch a full podcast, watch a clip instead. You'll be as entertained and as informed. That's my guarantee. That's why you gotta subscribe to Dostcast Clips.
So I'll just give you a little backstory to that
Okay.
before getting there. So it's the 16th year of my literary career, where in 2008 was when my first book on the history of the Mysore royal family called Splendors of Royal Mysore came out. That's a different story in itself as to how and why. That for another podcast. But, while researching on that, by chance, I came across this lady's mention called Gohar Jan, and she was a visiting musician at the Mysore Palace, and she died there in 1930. And it was a thin file of some of the letters, and it said she was the first gramophone celebrity of India to ever record in the subcontinent, and that she was born of a Hindu grandmother, an Armenian Christian father, a British grandfather, and she was in fact baptized at the Holy Trinity Church in Allahabad, and then later converted to Islam and became mother and daughter. Mother was Badi Malka Jan and this lady was Gohar Jan, and they went to Banaras where they changed their religion and became tawaifs or courtesans, and became courtesans in the court of Nawab Wajid Ali Shah. And at the turn of the century, 20th century, when we had recording technology come from abroad, from Europe, from London, from Paris, Germany, she was the first artist to record. So there were probably 3 lines or 4 lines of her biographical details that were there in the Mysore Palace archives. And something in me turned and I said, this seems like such a fascinating story that is just dying to be told. And I decided almost on an impulse there that I need to tell Gohar Jan's story. Now, usually I take decisions on an impulse. Most often I regret, but this was sadly, this was fortunately one where I did not have to regret, because I didn't know how to go about the research here, to be frank. I had by chance come across a person at the place of their death, in Mysore, where she died in 1930. She had lived there for 2 years. And those letters there were a few letters where she's pleading for help from the Maharaja's government. Don't cut my income tax and increase my salary. And then she dies mysteriously in the KR hospital there in Mysore. And there are people claiming a baker, a confectioner, a maid, saying she owned 2 annas to me, 4 rupees to me, and they're all making claims to the Maharaja's government. And it was very sad that this was surely a diva of her times who had come to such, poverty and penury, and that she died so lonely with nobody by her bedside to shed tears for her. And to be honest, I even went to the KR hospital masquerading as her grandson to find her death certificate, which I actually found, and I've put it in that book. My name is
What was the
Gohar
cause
Jan.
of death?
It was unknown. That's
Okay.
what has been mentioned there. The date and other things were mentioned, but it was left unknown reasons for death. So maybe she committed her own death or whatever, because she died when she was 57. So it was not such a ripe old age to die. And then I even went again as a grandson to find her, her tomb. Because I also wanted to know where the first gramophone celebrity of this country, recorded artist, lay. And there was a Kabristan committee in Mysore, and that Maulvi who came along with me to show this. That side is all the pre-independence graves, and so we went all over the place searching grave to grave if the epitaph had any details, but unfortunately it didn't.
You couldn't find the grave?
No. So the first.
What do you tell your family and friends when you go about these excursions? Because you've been, what's the right word? Like the gods of the muse have possessed you, so now you must pursue it.
I think before nobody used to understand my madness. And at that time when I was doing this Goharjan and Mysore book, I was in a regular corporate job. I was with Citibank and GE Money and Hewlett Packard and all these. And my colleagues and, including my bosses in those review meetings, they said, why are you doing all this? I mean, every weekend would mean going away on research trips, going on loss of pay, extended leaves, when there's a team outing to some resort or some film show and this and that, I'm rummaging through graves to look for Goharjan's grave. The motivation nobody understood. Today, a lot of them write to me saying, my God, you've made something else of your life while we are still stuck in the same corporate rut. So hopefully they understand the things now. But it was a different, I think a calling was coming from somewhere else. So Goharjan, so I literally chased her through the length and breadth of India and even outside India over the next 4 or 5 years. That research took me 4 or 5 years after that. From Azamgarh, where she was born, to Banaras, where she converted to Islam, to Calcutta, where she lived. She was always called Goharjan Kalkatte Wali. So Calcutta had a lot of information to give. Then Mysore, Madras, Bombay, all places, Darbhanga, Rampur, wherever she lived significant periods of time. And also outside India. So I went to London and Berlin.
You were pursuing this single-handedly, dropping everything else.
Yes. Had self-financed.
After this book, after this leaflet or a book that you found that was this thin,
yes,
you decided to dedicate your life to searching for this lost star whose voice had you listened to by that point? Had you listened to some music or no?
Yeah, after coming back, then I started Googling about her, then seeing if
After financing the trip, you Googled?
Yes. So like in Berlin, so interestingly, there was this gentleman who came to record her, Frederick William Gaisberg, who was a German agent, a recording agent from the Gramophone Company of London, who came all over the world on expeditions. They were also called recording expeditions. Just like in the Middle Ages, you used to go on expeditions to discover new lands. This man was coming to discover new voices. And so they knew nothing of the local music. They just saw whoever was commercially viable, they would record them. And the interesting part was when recording technology came to India, all over India, north, south, east, west, it was women who embraced it. We, the great men, we stayed away from it. There were lots of, inhibitions, superstitions that if you record into that evil English instrument, you will lose your voice, the gods will be displeased and all of that. So truly the grit and ingenuity of these women who negotiated their terms also. Goharjan managed to negotiate about 3,000 rupees for one recording session, which was like a princely sum those days. 1902 we are talking about. And that made them superstars because they just became overnight, wealthy to the brim. And there were so many apocryphal stories about her. She would go on her Ghoda Gadi, in the Eden Gardens and the entire Maidan area in Calcutta. And for that, once the Viceroy's cavalcade crosses her, and she's fair-skinned, Armenian, converted. So he thinks, and she always wore fantastic jewelry and goggles and all of that. And he thought she was the Maharani of some Riyasat and doffed his hat or something to her. And she also acknowledged him and drove away, apparently. And later he realized that she was a courtesan and then summoned her, and she was to pay a fine because it was a crime for common Indians to drive Ghoda Gadis of that feetons.
But she was so rich she could pay the fine.
She paid a fine every day of 1,000 rupees apparently.
Was she the first pop star?
Yes, pop star, exactly.
No, but then the issue is like who was listening to her, because Indians couldn't afford gramophones, I'm assuming.
No, not at all. They were 250 rupees was the cost of the machine, but those discs were probably much lesser. And so they were community gramophone listening sessions.
Right, like the same way they have the early days of the TV when one family has the TV and
Correct.
everyone else comes and watches it.
Yeah. And these were till then, I mean, especially classical music, concerts and soirees, they were only for the rich and at least in North India, in Southern India, in temples, because temples were still around, the temple economy and culture we were talking about in the previous discussion, where it's not just worship, but also concerts, everything happening, it was accessible. But in Northern India, North is it's a euphemism for all of Eastern India, everything. There it was only in zamindars houses or in nawabs, and you could listen to music, classical music. So for a common man to even be able to hear Gauhar Jan's voice sitting in the confines of a community gathering of near their house was a big deal, because they never could dream to enter her soiree. So that democratized music. It made them so rich. So Gauhar Jan's photographs began to appear on matchboxes made in Austria. You still have in that book, I have put photographs of made in Austria with her picture on it. And she started earning so much, properties, all over Calcutta. And not only her, several other women. There was Janki Bai of Allahabad, Zohra Bai Agrewali, Malka Jan of Agra.
And you have Zohra Bhai's music on your SoundCloud, which, by the way, for listeners and viewers, has 450K followers.
Yeah.
You've got Zohra Bhai's recordings on the Archive of Indian Music, right?
Yeah. I'll tell a little more about how the Archive of Indian...
Okay, sure.
This was a long backstory, which I think sets a context as to why that is important. So this was Gauhar Jan and her very, very fascinating life.